They called her just the help. Then he stood up and said her name. "I reckon she's the only one in this town with a real backbone," he said. The town of Marrow Creek had a way of folding people into the seams of its life or flinging them out like the dregs from a grain sack. It was built along a creek that never quite ran free, the water caught and bunched in shallow channels between weathered rocks. The wind found the town's wide, sleeping streets every afternoon and chased dust into the saloon door, rattling the panes and making the kerosene lamps tremble. There was a small line of clapboard and brick, a church steeple that pointed like an accusation into the bare sky, a blacksmith's forge, a general store smelling of leather and coffee, and at the corner, a saloon with a porch sagging from years of boots and bad weather. She stood behind the counter in that saloon, not because she liked the smell of stale beer or the clink of poker chips, but because she always had. The world had a way of being unkind, and she learned early that doing what needed doing, sweeping floorboards, mending a torn sleeve, warming a tin cup until the steam curled, was a kind of prayer without words. She kept her hair tucked under a battered hat, her hands a map of hard seasons. Calluses like old promises, nails trimmed close, the knuckles faintly scarred where they had met an unforgiving life. They called her Maeve Hart. They called her plain-spoken. They called her steady. They called her just the help when it suited them, and when they wanted something done without looking themselves as though they had been careless. She answered more with work than words. Quiet was her shield. People assumed silence meant nothing left to say. It did not. It meant a lot had been said and used up already. She had come to Marrow Creek with a trunk and a letter and a hunger that was both practical and deep. The letter had been thin and faded, written in a hand that trembled as if the ink had been pulled from a weary throat. It told of a brother gone to claim a homestead and a farm that needed hands to last the winter. The promise in the letter was small: room, board, and a place to begin again. When she arrived, the brother was not there. Only a note pinned to the door, clipped and indifferent. Gone south for work. Keep the place that had been 3 winters ago. The house had been cold until she learned to stack wood just so, until she coaxed a stubborn stove into life and hung her small life from its warming belly. The town offered no immediate kindness, but it offered wages for the work she would do, and a saloon where the owners looked the other way if someone slept too long on the porch after a card game lost them more than their pride. Marrow Creek liked to judge. It judged by the shine on one's boots, the cut of a coat, the steadiness of speech. And those with silver tongues, the preacher's wife with her narrow smile, the sheriff who kept a tidy beard and tidy rules for everyone else, the land-rich, boot-polished men who came through on occasion, would stand on the porch and watch, making pronouncements like weather reports. Maeve learned early that people's laughter could be a weather front too, coming in heavy and cold enough to leave frost on a soul. She learned to keep her head down and her hands busy. The saloon itself was a place of unsteady light. Lamplight glow at night, sun-warmed wood during the day. It smelled of coffee that had seen better beans and of stew that had spent too many hours above the stove. The bar was scarred and etched with initials and promises that meant nothing now. The floorboards creaked in familiar places where the bartender walked. Boots on floorboards made the familiar music of the town. A kettle hissed obediently from the back as her hands moved with a rhythm she had been taught by hunger and necessity. There was a hush in the saloon when she poured a tin cup of coffee for an old cowhand, when she wiped the rim with the edge of a rag, when she slid a plate of stew across to someone with thumbs drumming the table. Her motions were small kindnesses that kept the place from falling into worse weather. It was the kind of town where a small kindness could feel like a gamble. One morning, late while the saloon was still waking, a few patrons already nursing the heat of their mugs, the early light coming in thin and golden, Maeve noticed a boy on the porch steps. He was a small thing, maybe 10, wearing a coat too large that hung from his shoulders like a sail. His face was streaked with tears and dust. He held a photograph with a thumb that trembled, the black and white image already blurred at the edges. He had walked from a dust-blown camp outside town where an accident had taken place the night before. His father, a man with hands like the rungs of a ladder and a laugh that used to roll like thunder, had not come home. The preacher's wife had refused to take him in. The sheriff said there were procedures, forms to file, not hands to hold a child's grief. Maeve saw the boy as one sees a wounded animal, something to be tended before the world poked long, uncomfortable fingers at the wound. She set down her rag and took his small hand. The gesture, simple to the point of being obvious, was noticed. The preacher's wife's lips sought a prayer, then a barb. A land-rich rancher scoffed and clinked his cup as though the silence might be heavy enough to sink her. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. His mouth, which held town rules, decided to hold them in his pocket instead of speaking. Maeve wrapped the boy in a spare blanket from behind the bar, and the saloon's kettle breathed steam into the morning. She fetched an extra plate, piled it with stew, a biscuit that had been saved, and a slice of bacon. The boy ate like meaning was new to him, quick, with hunger that made his body forget to be shy. Maeve had a way of pouring kindness that made no announcement about how this changed her life. It cost her little of coin and much of the small privacy she kept like a coin in a worn pocket, but she did it anyway. They called it charity when she did not ask for notice. They called it folly when it required time and explanation. The preacher's wife made a show of folding her hands and saying a prayer too loud. "You shouldn't encourage dependence," she said. Chin lifted like she looked down the whole town and named them all with a flick of her eyes. "A woman like you should be careful." Maeve heard it and kept her hands busy. Her silence was not ignorance. It was a claim given without boasting. She knew the boy needed warmth and the steady sound of two voices that said the world was not entirely unmade. That morning, when the boy's breath slowed and he smiled at the bowl like it had been given to him by grace, Maeve felt the town tilt in a small way. Some turned their faces away to hide the twinge of shame. Some made a show of eating more loudly to drown out the soft noise that a cup of stew could make in a child's chest. Across the room, a man watched in repose with a hat pulled low. He had come in earlier than usual and sat in a corner where the light slanted thin and kept its distance. The first thing any sensible person noticed about him was the way his hands rested on his knees. Fingers long, fingers used to a saddle, the kind of hands that could redraw a life if they needed to. His face was shadowed by a week's worth of stubble and a jaw that had the habit of being clenched at the world. He was the kind of man who at a glance suggested a past, the kind of past that did not sit still under polite conversation. A war veteran's posture in its way, maybe an outlaw's tendency in his eyes. Folks in Marrow Creek liked the shorthand of labels. It made conversation simpler. For some he was that buried past cowboy, for others, nothing more than a man who drank his coffee like a ritual. He watched Maeve the way people did when they stopped pretending they weren't listening. There was a small something in his chest that pulled like a tack on a map. Not interest forgetful of modesty, but an old pressure that had once mapped his life in lines and would not be erased. He saw in Maeve's posture the thing he had thought himself lost to, steadiness not as stubbornness but as an act of defiance. When the preacher's wife spoke and others with her small-town cruelty made murmurs, the man in the corner, who the town thought better left unnamed, tightened his jaw and stood. He did not stride to the center of the room like a hero unwrapping himself. He walked with the careful step of someone who had learned what it meant to choose when to act. He set his hat on the bar and placed his cup down like an offer. His voice was low when he spoke, not loud, but edged with a weight that made the room quiet. "She's not asking for your pity," he said. "She's asking for a place to do what she knows how to do. Don't make it harder." The preacher's wife's mouth curled. "And who's that to say? Men ought to mind the rules." The man's eyes met hers, steady and unafraid. There were things in his gaze like a story told too many times and finally told right. In the hush of the saloon, he said the words that made the room rearrange itself. "Her hands are honest. That means more than theirs." It was a small victory. A white flag waved between two stubborn thorns, and it mattered. For Maeve, the intervention was not fireworks. She blushed, a touch that felt improper and fine, and went back to polishing the counter. When she let herself breathe, there was a small thread of something she had not expected: recognition. People turned their faces to the window or the dust or the nothing of their drinks, and in that space, the cowboy's words settled like grain. The preacher's wife snapped her lips closed, as if the town had been righted by a small shove. The sheriff cleared his throat in a sound that pretended he had never been impatient to speak in the first place. Maeve did not look for his face at first. She had been trained, by life and habit, to not expect salutes or rescue. But hours and days folded over like pages, and she found him by the door in the late afternoons, boots in the dirt and hat tipped, watching the creek. He was not an intruder. He did not keep conversation for the middle of the floor. He observed. There is a kind of seeing that is the beginning of faith. He saw the work in the way her shoulders tightened against the winter wind. He saw small things. The embroidery she had added unseen to the collar of a coat. A map someone had shown her of a field he recognized. The precise way she tightened a hitch on a saddle. Observing meant he noticed the shape of her silence and decoded it as care. He had a history the town preferred to keep as rumor. Maeve had heard it in pieces. A town rumor pulled apart and stitched anew with each telling. He had, some said, been a man of bad decisions once. Others swore he'd been at the wrong battle at the wrong time, or had once turned a hand against a man with a coin too many. He had a way of moving that suggested he carried more than he let out. These were the kinds of men who suited the edges of towns. They kept to themselves but stepped into the middle when there was no other option. She found in him something she didn't expect. A kind of slow mercy. It came to him like the tide comes, not all at once but as a conviction that he would not cross certain lines. When the boy from the porch returned once, his father gone and their whole life slipped into an uncertain arrangement of how to and why not, the town came with thin applause and thin offers. The sheriff took the kid's name down like a ledger. The preacher's wife gave a package of clothes but with an attached lecture about how charity could ruin a man. Maeve reached for the boy's hand often enough to remind him that someone was steady in the small, meaningful things. The cowboy sat on the porch one evening and watched them, and when he left he tied a small thing to the boy's wrist. A thin leather cord threaded through with a tin charm. A small gift that meant someone saw you and wanted you to keep that seeing. He did not speak of his past. When he spoke, it was of simple things, the weather, the way a colt would take to a fence, the color of the sky. When he did speak of other things, the talk came like a confession, in fits and starts, in images that were small but enough. One night, after a storm had come through and left the prairie smelling like fresh earth and worn leather, he sat at the bar with a cup cooling between his hands and asked about a scar at Maeve's temple she kept hidden with her hair. She had it from a spring morning when a gate had given way and a load of hay had landed wrong. She did not speak often of the things that chipped at her. She had been widowed. The only good man she'd loved before had been taken in a way that made her hold her breath in public, as if the world might be offended she dared to keep living. When she said the name, it was small and private. He listened, the way someone listens to a map without knowing why they might need that map later. He did not give easy comforts. He handed, instead, the quiet of his attention. There is a kind of kindness that is simply to register another human's small and aching map. It is both rare and healing. His own wounds were not asked for. They emerged like weeds. He had been a man who bore guilt like a heavy coat. Once he had been part of a cattle drive that ended in a quarrel where a man had died. The memory offered him no mercy. Years after, he had left the ranch that had made him and his name burned into his mind. He had ridden away one night and found himself drawn to small towns with churches that kept time by bell and saloons that knew how to keep a promise without demanding much. He liked Marrow Creek for its edges. He liked the people who did not pretend to be civil beyond what their work demanded. He liked Maeve most because she did not ask him to explain his past in order to accept him. She accepted him with her small, downward looks and the steady work of her hands. He watched from a distance, judged by the town as if he had to get a permit for the emotion he felt, and slowly he found that watching was not enough. There came a day when the town's small cruelties widened like a drought. The preacher's wife had decided to hold a community dinner and had publicly snubbed Maeve, the saloon being too coarse a place for any woman worth her salt. She claimed in a voice that made the baker smile and the men tilt their heads like a chorus. She argued, with the soft certainty of someone who has never been required to do the real work of survival, that the source of the stew tasted of that saloon and other low things. She invited everyone to the church's new hall and set a place for those of certain standing. Maeve was not invited. The town's whisper came like a wind shift. People who had accepted her quiet help with a slight nod suddenly found reason to bathe themselves in the approval of the preacher's wife. Maeve felt the burn of it. Not because she needed attendance to feel human. She had long learned to build humanity out of what she could hold in her two hands, but because the town's rejection was a public yardstick and she had once tried to measure herself against that yard in a life she no longer wanted. She had come to understand the small dignity of being useful, of being present in the sticky work of mornings and afternoons. And so when the preacher's wife called her improvised in front of the mirror-cheeked women who came for ratings, Maeve kept her silence, wiped a counter as if that were sufficient comfort, and replied to none of the barbed questions that were asked. It was a small thing. Then, when she decided to prepare a supper of her own for the homeless families on the edge of town who could not afford the preacher's woman's polished plates, she made the stew she always made. Beans that had been soaked overnight, meat from a trustworthy source, onions caramelized slow enough to make the kitchen smell like an old hymn. There is comfort in a pot that has seen the underside of the stove. It communicates in the language of aromas and softness. She set out a table on the saloon's back porch, the wood warmed by a weak sun, and she invited those who would come. Word moved like low fire in a dry place. The preacher's wife learned and decided to make the motion of scandal out of it. She sent a posse of polite glares and a woman with a face like folded parchment to assert that Maeve should not presume to take on charity without her sanction. The town took that as permission to judge. People who had once considered Maeve a quiet and useful woman now found themselves galled by the audacity of someone doing good without asking approval. The inevitable came, public humiliation threaded with accusing eyes. One of the preacher's friends, the kind whose piety was a coat that did not fit their shoulders, stood near the back porch and looked at her as one might regard an animal that had gotten loose and eaten the flowers. "You're making a scene," he said, amplifying his voice like a bell that must be heard by the whole town. "You ought to know your place." Maeve's hands tightened on the edge of the pot. There was a voice in her chest that had been practicing silence like prayer, and for a moment she felt it unravel. She had come to town with a letter and a hope. She had kept herself in a place people could overlook, and when she wanted to give of what she had, to feed those whose roofs had been weak against the winter, they turned their sour faces at her. The boy she had fed the week before sat with the other children, watching a woman's lip curl in public. There was a low hum of people's disapproval. He was there then, at his usual place near the back door, watchful. When the man raised his voice at Maeve, the cowboy's hand brushed the rim of his hat as if remembering something. He rose without drama and walked across the yard, the dust folding under his boots like an old friend. He did not shout and he did not step into melodrama. He walked up to the man who had spoken and, in a voice low and even, said, "You show respect for things worth it, or you learn to earn it." The man's eyes hardened like a blow that came not from the hand but from the truth. He did not want to measure himself against a woman he had been taught to look down upon. No one in a town likes to be told they are small. The cowboy's presence in that sun-warmed wood made the man think twice. He retreated, his friends either with him or without, and the preacher's wife did what she always did. Arranged her features as though the weather might be protesting. She looked at him with something sharpened, a dislike for being made wrong. When the sound died, a hush settled, and Maeve felt the weight of it like a hand from an old friend. She had not expected the cowboy to speak. She had not expected that anyone would. She had, for all effect, been alone. For all the town's whisper and judgment, this man had chosen to intervene in a way that did not demand payment. He had not waved his hat in triumph. He had stood and told the truth as he saw it. That was something rare. After the town had thinned out and the sun had moved its lazy shadow across the yard, he found her sitting on a wooden crate, a mug cooling between her calloused palms. He sat beside her without being asked. Sometimes the best company is that of a person who does not require a show of speech. For a long time they watched the creek that moved as if it had decided to grant the world a small grace. She said nothing. He did not press. After some time, he shifted closer and, in a voice that seemed to belong to the wind more than to the men in the town, murmured, "Your hands on mine make even the hardest day feel like Sunday morning." It was not a line he had rehearsed. It came as a small admission of the effect her quiet had on him. The protection it offered was like being put in soft light. For Maeve, it was not florid romance so much as acknowledgement. The words settled between them like a hearth. They fit the shape of the silence she kept. Her face warmed with something like a remembered sunset, and she let her fingers curl around his like a thing that at last belonged to a steady rhythm. The winter moved in as winters do, slow and steady, bringing with it nights so cold the breath of the world hung in the porch light like small ghosts. Men and women found their routines. Cattle were folded in, fences repaired. The preacher's wife continued to perform and to scold. The sheriff kept petty order with a ledger and an easy eye. The cowboy, whose real name the town would murmur was Jonah Reed, rode his rounds with the steady gait of someone used to measuring land and people with the same attention. He kept his distance in the practical ways, not intruding in her work with the friends of Marrow Creek, and yet he kept showing up where she had been, sometimes to fetch a jug of coffee for a late-night fix, sometimes to drop off a small package of flour, sometimes to sit in a corner near the stove and talk of nothing at all. They had small exchanges that decanted into something larger. She taught him proper knots when he had to tighten a halter. He taught her the names of birds that nested in the willow next to the creek. He would peek at the horizon, then at her work-worn hands, and talk about horizons like a promise that could be trusted if one tended to it. Maeve, in turn, learned to let him see the small things she had kept hidden. One evening she opened the trunk she had brought with her and showed him the letters she had kept from the man she had lost. Letters that smelled faintly of smoke and sun, ink slurred with a life that had been lived hard. She let him read a page before folding it away like a prayer. The cowboy listened as if those letters were scripture, as if the lines of ink were a map of a person worth remembering. Their interactions were not large, but they were not small either. They built a language where words were sparing and actions spoke in the dialect of tenderness. He began to sit on her porch with the softest of manners, not as a claim but as a offering, and she began to leave a kettle set out so he might have hot coffee when he came from the cold of a night ride. There were evenings when neither spoke more than the temperature of the room, when the world outside felt like a story told in a different house. Their silence grew warm. But a town is the dangerous kind of mirror. Appearances take on shadow. The preacher's wife watched and interpreted. She drew conclusions and sent them like little arrows. She called the sheriff to remind him of the town's supposed standards for relationships. For who should wear which ring on what finger, for who could set a hand upon another without invitation. The sheriff, who liked rules that kept his roll tidy, kept a polite distance. But gossip is something that grows with its own thirst and will not be satisfied. He prefaced his questions to Maeve with civic concern and then sharpened them into something that felt like commandment. Rumors have weight in dry towns. They tip like stacks of dry wood, and when one is kicked, the pile will tumble. It was a small push, a question about whether she had intentions with Jonah, and the town folded itself into judgment. Maeve felt the pressure like a wind that made the world creak. There is a kind of shame that is public and designed to shame. She refused to dance to a tune that questioned her integrity. She had been mocked before for being just the help, and she did not think a man's interest was a sin to be corrected by the world's loud mouth. Jonah saw the town gather like buzzards. He stepped in once more, not to deflect by obvious means but to assert, quietly and clearly, that the way one loved or did not love was no business for the town to legislate. "She is free to take what's good for her," he said in the saloon once, voice low, and in saying it he risked himself in the way men sometimes do. The preacher's wife intercepted with a sermon about proper roles, and the sheriff pretended to cough as though disapproving coughs were the highest law. There was an edge in his blue eyes then, a calm, bitter edge like a blade kept clean. There was a night when the town's small cruelties finally found a blade to use. A man with a grudge took to the streets in heated anger over a debt, and when he saw Jonah and Maeve on the porch, he chose to attack not Jonah's past but Maeve's present. He accused her of theft in a voice loud enough to pull the town from sleep. He had been one of those men who preferred accusations to logic, who found strength in the momentum of outrage. It was a cheap move and cruel, a man's attempt to hurt where a woman would feel it most, in front of the people who had judged her. The accusation spun like a wheel. Some looked away, not from sympathy but from fear of being labeled wrong. A few muttered about rules and the need for the sheriff to step in. Maeve stood there, hands clenched at her side, not looking away. Her face remained unflinching. She had not stolen. The accusation was cruel, a greedy thing that wanted her to fold. She felt something in her chest that was ancient and fierce, dignity that had been earned slowly and would not be taken without a fight. Jonah stepped forward. Men in the saloon parted like reeds in a storm. He did not shout. He did not brandish fists. He walked up to the man who made the accusation and placed his hand on the latter's shoulder in a movement that was small and final. "If you think to bring charge, bring proof," he said. "You'll not cough out lies and expect a life to be ruined here." The man started to protest, then faltered when Jonah's gaze did not move, and the town found itself listening. Jonah's truth, spoken plainly, shook the room into stillness. A hush like the settling of dust came. The sheriff, sensing the room had less appetite for spectacle than he'd feared, muttered about procedures. The crowd thinned when it saw there was no benefit to bullying. Maeve did not smile. She did not need Jonah to stand for her. She stood herself. But when the shouting stopped, and when the man slunk back into whatever path of slander he had chosen, Maeve's shoulders loosened and she felt Jonah's hand cover hers like a shield. She could have left with a grace and a fury that was hers alone, but she stayed. She continued to feed the people with hands that had known both sorrow and the comfort of being useful. Jonah continued to sit on the back porch and watch the stars with her, and they began to learn the cadence of a life that included each other. Their company was not announced with ribbons. It was an earned belonging. It was, then, a small thing to see the town shift. Not wholesale. Small towns change like a stream-cut stone, one patient movement at a time. People who had mocked Maeve in public found themselves pausing when she smiled and letting the pause become a small, admitting nod that recognized a person of value. The preacher's wife never quite apologized. Apologies do not sit well on certain shoulders, but her sermons grew less venomous. Jonah's presence had made a difference, and his steady attention to the small things crowned Maeve with the effect of being seen. Months went by. Seasons traded hats like horses in a parade. Winter softened into spring, and Marrow Creek began to look less like a place suspended in complaint and more like a place that might hold its people without scolding them for living. Jonah and Maeve did little things that added up in a way that matters. He mended a lean-to with nails and patience. She baked a pie for a sick child. He taught the boy on the porch how to throw his weight in the saddle. She eventually kept a spare room ready for a traveling teacher when he decided to stay. There is a tender thing that happens in small-town lives. Two people who meet at the edges of their own suffering discover that being together is a work of days. One evening, as the light dropped thin and the smell of coal and stew mixed in the saloon's kitchen, Jonah asked her to come for a ride. No fanfare, only the quiet invitation that meant they would go beyond the town's boundaries and be two against the rising fields. She agreed and felt the word like a freeing cord released small by small. They rode along the creek, and Jonah's hands worked the reins with patience. The horses pushed their breaths into the sunset like small steam engines. The world smelled of late grass and something green that had learned to live through frost. Jonah told her stories in fragments. A day in a corral with a stubborn bull. A night on a mesa where the stars kept watch like elders. He never spoke in huge confessions. He let his history rest in images. Maeve answered with the small, weary stories of her own. An early morning with a lost calf. A winter when a roof almost surrendered to the snow's weight. These were ordinary things, and ordinary made the world true. At the ridge where the land unfurled into a sliver of horizon, Jonah stopped the horse and they watched a field of wildflowers that had sprung up in a place the town had mostly ignored. The sight held them. It was as if both had been waiting for the world to offer something bright that did not demand anything of them. He turned to her and said with a soft gravity, "If you wanted to run, Maeve, you could. I'd follow. But it'd be kinder if we didn't have to run." She laughed, a small sound like a bell, and rested her forehead against the horseman's shoulder. The world felt like a place where someone might hold you without making you small. The days thereafter were full of building. Jonah's hands began to be entrusted with the things women in town assumed he had been born to command. The back fence here, the roof beam there. He did it because it was needed and because it gave him a way to show he belonged not only as a protector but as a partner. The preacher's wife, predictably, was not pleased. People in positions of self-proclaimed righteousness often resent the real work of kindness because it is not performative. The church's bells did not ring out criticism in the way she wanted. But there were moments when she would make a point of praising the proprieties she believed in while cutting a glance at the two who had quietly acquired a small life together. But the town had changed enough that she found fewer friends to echo her harshness. There was a time when the past, as it often does, rose like a tide. News came down the line of a land dispute involving a ranch that had once held Jonah's family's name on a small plaque. The owner, a man whose money was sharp enough to cut bread, began to lay claim to land that a neighbor had worked for years. Marrow Creek is built on the bones of such disputes. Men began to take sides. The ranch hands who worked for that owner gathered like a swarm. Fences were measured by the eye. Words were exchanged and fists traded in a way that made Jonah's jaw set like a stone. This was the kind of fight Jonah was born to not avoid. He had the kind of memory that remembered injustice as a light someone had to hold up. He had a past that tasted of old fights and long remorse. He wanted to do it differently this time. He tried first to speak to the man with the money, to see if there was a way to mend the line without breaking it. The man laughed like a dog sniffing for weakness. "You don't have a claim here, Reed," he said. "You left when it got hard." The words landed like a stone in Maeve's chest. Jonah did not rise to the bait. He tightened his jaw and tried a route of reason. It did not work. The town's men fell into rows. The sheriff came with a pocketful of cold procedures. The man with money decided the easiest way to tilt the town was to remarry the preacher's wife into an arrangement of influence. He bought the bakery and promised jobs to those who would support him. The town's politics began to twist. It culminated one night when men came into the saloon asking for help and Jonah told them he would not be used as a pawn. The man with the money took offense. Such men always did when someone refused instruction, and decided to publicly shame Jonah. He accused him of being an old outlaw, of using his past as a cloak for present scheming. Jonah's silence fell between the accusations like a thick rope. Maeve felt it too, the heaviness in the saloon, and the town's old appetite for spectacle licked its teeth. Then came the night the man with money set a trap. He hired a few roughs to create a scene, to make Jonah look like a man who could not be trusted. For Maeve, watching it unfold was like seeing a slow burn on a piece of dry cloth. The roughs went in with plan and purpose. They spilled drink and bumped chairs. They called Jonah names that had been used before. A scuffle began, the sort that would have been normal if not for the man's money steering things into a theater of cruelty. It was not the scuffle that mattered as much as a separate, more dangerous act. One of the men pushed Maeve hard when she tried to break the fight. He had the smell of smoke and stale beer on his breath and that look of men who have never learned to see a woman as equal in the room. Maeve fell back with a cry that was small and then swallowed, like a bird frightened into quiet. The saloon seemed to hold its breath. Jonah moved like a man who had learned to measure his own temper with regard for the lives around him. He stepped up and faced the man who had pushed Maeve, and for a moment the world narrowed to their breathing. Jonah struck the man once, not in the theatrical way that makes stories, but in the simple, decisive way that ends a present threat. The man reeled and then rose after an embarrassed moment, stumbled out, and the brawl died because the point had been made that cruelty would not be tolerated. But the man with money took this as an invitation to press charges. He called the sheriff and demanded that Jonah be arrested for assault. The sheriff, who had been busy measuring the power of money with the town's rules, hesitated. The law is often courted with the thickness of one's purse and the softness of the town's will to stand for the right. Jonah did not run. He let the sheriff take his statement and the man with money called witnesses. Jonah's past was circulated in small-town fashion and used like a weapon. They tried to paint him as dangerous, as an outlaw who would incite violence. The town took sides. The preacher's wife sneered behind her hand. The man with money's men smirked. Maeve stood in a place where she could not be erased. She gave a statement plain and solid of what had happened. Her voice was steady. She did not make the night more dramatic than it was. She gave the truth as she had always given her work, without embellishment, and with an economy of moral power that made it hard to deny. At the hearing, the room swelled with the town's interest like a kettle ready to boil. The man with money mounted his accusations with the air of someone who expects to fillet a lobster with a butter knife. He offered false witnesses who had been told what to say. Jonah listened like an old tree listening to wind, firm and unmoving. Maeve's testimony was a small rock that held against the current. The sheriff, who had earlier preferred theatrics, found himself between the town's appetite for spectacle and the hard facts presented by Maeve. He had to choose whether the law would be bent by money or lifted by truth. In the end, the law listened to the plainness of the woman from the saloon. The judge, who had been a visiting official, unfamiliar with the town's gossip, looked at the records and, more importantly, at the faces in the room. He read the facts and not the rumors. Jonah was acquitted of the charges. The man with money was ordered to pay for the damages to the saloon and to leave the town for a time. It was a small justice, but it rang in the town like a bell. Jonah looked at Maeve with an odd expression. Not relief alone, but an expression that weighed like gratitude and more. He had been defended by someone with little voice and a lot of integrity, and he did not take that for granted. When the town began to breathe as though it had been freed of a barbed wire in the chest, people re-examined the lines they had drawn. The preacher's wife began to talk less, and in her quiet she began, in small moments, to notice the warmth of honest work. The man with money lingered long enough to consider his losses and then rode on when his name would fetch him no more advantage. Jonah and Maeve, freed from the spectacle of trial, found their relationship settling into a rhythm of shared chores, shared confidences, and the steady accumulation of trust. They did not marry in a show. There was no extravagant announcement. They built a small life that gathered neighbors like seeds. Jonah moved into the small house behind the saloon that had been vacant for a time. He painted a porch rail and learned to coax the stove to life as Maeve had taught him. He repaired fences with the methodical patience of a man used to mending things he loved. Maeve, in turn, learned to lean on him in ways that were not helpless but human. She let him make breakfast sometimes and accept his small, constant help with the chores that had once been hers alone. They found, in the small exchanges of bread and saddle, the enormous truth that a life could be built like a stable, with the right pieces leaned together against weather. Years passed. The town of Marrow Creek learned to measure its value by different things. Jonah worked to expand the town's feed store and used his hands to make a corral that would carry a good name for years. Maeve started an evening school where she taught the town's children how to read and write, and in the mornings she baked bread that smelled of him walking into the house and of mornings settled into the bones. The boy from the porch grew, lean and sure, and learned the language of animals under Jonah's stern and kind tutelage. There were small sorrows, the kind that come with living and being imperfect. A drought came one season and took the green out of the fields for a time. They lost a neighbor to an illness that had crept from town to town like rumor. The preacher's wife finally died with a quiet of her own that made the town pause and measure its own pettiness. Jonah and Maeve attended the funeral not with sentiment but with a hand that knew how to be steady in loss. They left flowers at the grave, not because they had a debt to pay, but because they were people who had been given more than they expected. Maeve kept a small box under her bed filled with the letters from the man she had loved and lost. Jonah respected it without question. He had his own small things hidden in a trunk, a piece of a map where his family had once driven cattle, a silver coin with a scratch through its face. They shared these things over quiet nights and rarely used words larger than was necessary. In the heat of summer or the slant of winter, their hands would find each other like a familiar weather pattern. Steady, welcome, and enough. One evening, older now and with the town's dust in the grooves of their hands, they sat on the porch watching the horizon breathe a slow purple. Jonah reached out and took her hand. There was no need for any grand declaration. He rubbed his thumb across the scar at her temple, the the scar she had once hidden with her hair and retraced with her fingers sometimes when a memory was sharp. "You're the best thing I've seen in this life," he said in a voice that carried the weight of what that might mean when one had seen too much. She looked at him like someone who had given her life its small, steady shape. "And you," she said, "are the one who stood up when the town forgot how to be kind." He smiled as if he had been given a reprieve. The saloon's lamplight made the shadows soft and the night's sounds creak closer. Distant horse whinnies whined through the cracked windows of other houses, the kettle in a neighbor's kitchen that had begun to hiss. The town slept like a thing that had been mended. Years later, when Marrow Creek told stories of itself, it would tell them by the creek where the water moved like a hymn. They would tell the tale of the quiet woman who had been called just the help, and the man with the past who chose to stand by the truth. People would speak of the small kindnesses she had dispensed like coins, of the time the preacher's wife had stamped her heel and the town had learned to love a different measure of courage. Jonah's name would be attached to the story as the man who defended her, but Maeve's name would not be lost in the telling. The town had learned to call her by the name she deserved. If you ever travel down that road and stop at the saloon with its sun-warmed wood and its porch sagging from years of boots and bad weather, you might see a small plaque that reads, "Simply and without clangor, Maeve Hart and Jonah Reed." It will sit near the door where the lamplight catches it, polished by a dozen hands that have come and gone. People will tell you what they were taught to value in quick words, but if you pay close attention, you will hear the creak of the door and the clink of tin cups and the quiet exchange of two people who built a life out of the ordinary and made it extraordinary. Listen for the small things. The kettle hissing, the creak of a porch board, the soft whispers of low conversation, the distant horse whinnying in a field where two shadows walk. In the saloon, someone will pass by and give a nod. When you sit and let patience do its work, you might hear the story told again in the slow rhythm of the town's evening. It's a story told without fanfare, in the cadence of people who have learned that waiting is a kind of faith. Maeve's hands remained steady until the end. They served coffee, warmed the poor on cold nights, sewed and mended, and held those who needed shelter. Her voice did not become loud in the town's gossip. It remained, as it had always been, quiet and full. Jonah's presence was the kind of quiet salvation that could not be boasted about, a steadying force that found its meaning in the ordinary. They lived without much pretense and with more honesty for it. The town learned to measure worth by hands and hearts, not by a man's purse or a sermon's flourish. If her story hit you hard, don't forget the ones who stay quiet. They are the ones who build what lasts. People will travel to Marrow Creek to read the plaque and take pictures and tell the tale over coffee in distant towns, but the truth of their life will remain in the small monotony of everyday goodness. A pot simmering on an old stove, a hat laid on a peg, the swing of a porch that knows two sets of feet. She gave everything without asking, and finally someone gave back. There are towns that forget the small courage of tending, but Marrow Creek kept it. It learned that a woman's silence was not the absence of a voice but the presence of a work ethic that deserved more than gossip. It learned that a man with a rough history could find redemption not by dying for a cause but by living steadier than his past would have you expect. And it learned, in the way small towns sometimes do when given time and the right weather, that belonging is not something you receive like a gift but something you build with the people who stand with you in the smallest storms. Remember, some roots grow in silence. The town is quiet in that way now, a place where the echoes of old cruelty sometimes show up like weather reports and then leave again when the sun comes right. It is not a perfect place. No place is. But when someone's hands rest on another's and make the hardest day feel like Sunday morning, there is a kind of redemption that even the hardest weather cannot undo. And that's how a whisper changed a town.